When Sarah moved into her new apartment, she was excited to finally have her own place. It was a quiet building, mostly filled with elderly tenants, and she appreciated the peaceful atmosphere. The only downside was her next-door neighbor in apartment 6B. She never saw him, but every night around midnight, she heard strange noises coming from his apartment. Heavy footsteps, dragging sounds, and occasionally what sounded like faint whispers. At first, Sarah thought it was just her imagination. She told herself it was an old building, and the noises were probably due to creaky pipes or floorboards. But the sounds persisted, always at the same time, always growing louder. One evening, Sarah decided to ask around about the man in 6B. Her curiosity had gotten the best of her. She ran into the building's janitor, Mr. Collins, and casually mentioned the strange noises next door. Mr. Collins frowned. 6B? That apartment's been empty for years. Sarah's stomach dropped. That can't be right, she said. I hear someone in there every night. The janitor's face grew grim. No one's lived in 6B since old Mr. Roberts died. He was a bit of a recluse. Some say he lost his mind before he passed away. They say he'd wander the halls at night, dragging things across the floor, mumbling to himself. Sarah's heart raced. That night, she tried to sleep, but the noises began again, louder than ever. The dragging sound was right against the shared wall now, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Unable to take it anymore, Sarah grabbed her phone and called the building manager to come check the apartment. When the manager arrived, they went to 6B together. The door was locked, but after some effort, the manager opened it. The apartment was cold, covered in dust, and completely empty, except for deep, gouged marks on the floor, as if something had been dragged across it repeatedly. See, the manager said, clearly spooked himself. No one's here. But as Sarah stood in the doorway, she swore she heard a faint, raspy whisper from the back of the room, just out of sight. That night, the noises didn't come from 6B. They came from inside her own apartment. Jake had just moved into a small, affordable apartment in an old building. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was close to work, and that's all he cared about. The only odd thing was the basement. There was a door at the end of the hallway that led to the basement stairs, and his landlord had warned him not to go down there. It's old and dangerous, she said. Just stay away. One night, Jake was woken up by the sound of faint knocking. At first, he thought it was someone at his door, but when he listened closely, he realized it was coming from the basement. The knocks were slow, steady, and growing louder. Curiosity got the better of him, so he left his apartment to investigate. As he approached the basement door, the knocking stopped. He pressed his ear to the door and heard nothing. But then, as he was about to turn back, he heard a voice. Faint, almost like a whisper. "Let me out," the voice said. Jake froze. He wasn't sure if he had imagined it, but the voice was so weak, so desperate. "Hello," he called out. There was no response. He hesitated, then quickly went back to his apartment, locking the door behind him. He couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone or something was down there. The next night, the knocking returned, louder and more frantic. This time, Jake decided to ask his landlord about it. When he called her the next morning, her tone was serious. "I told you not to go near the basement. Don't listen to any sounds you hear." Jake, confused and unnerved, pressed her for more details. She sighed. Years ago, a man lived in the basement apartment. He was a recluse, never left his room. One day, he disappeared, but strange things started happening after that. Knocking, whispers, people who went down there never came back the same. Eventually, we had to seal it up. No one's been down there for years. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. But someone's knocking, someone's asking to be let out. "Don't listen to it," she snapped. "Whatever it is, it's not human." That night, the knocking was the loudest it had ever been, echoing through the walls. Jake stayed in his apartment, but just after midnight, the knocking turned into banging, followed by a slow creaking sound, like a door opening. His heart pounded as he realized the basement door had been locked until now. Suddenly, the knocks were at his apartment door. Emily lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever really happened. That was until the new neighbor moved into the house next door. It was a large, old house that had been vacant for years, and rumors swirled about why it had stayed empty for so long. But one day, a man arrived. He was quiet, kept to himself, and didn't seem interested in getting to know anyone. At first, Emily thought nothing of it. People move all the time, and some prefer to be left alone. But after a few weeks, strange things started happening. Every night, just as Emily was getting ready for bed, she would hear footsteps outside. Heavy, slow, and deliberate. They echoed through the walls of her house. She would check out the window, expecting to see someone walking down the street, but no one was ever there. One night, while sitting in her living room, she saw a shadow pass by the window. Startled, she ran to the window and looked out, but the street was empty. That's when she noticed something peculiar about her neighbor's house. There were no lights on, ever. Not a single window glowed with the soft light of a lamp or TV. The house looked completely abandoned, yet she knew someone was living there. Curiosity got the better of her. The next day, Emily approached one of the other neighbors, Mrs. Gibson, and asked about the man next door. Mrs. Gibson's face immediately darkened. "You shouldn't talk to him," she warned. "That house, well, no one's lived there for years." Emily frowned. "That's not true. I've seen the man who moved in." Mrs. Gibson shook her head. "No one moves into that house and stays for long." That night, Emily heard the footsteps again, but this time they didn't stop outside. They seemed to move closer, as if someone was walking directly toward her house. Her heart pounded as she listened. Then, there was a soft knock at her front door. She froze, too afraid to answer. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. She mustered the courage to look through the peephole, but when she did, no one was there. She quickly stepped back, her hands trembling, when suddenly her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Let me in." Emily dropped the phone. It was impossible. How could anyone be texting her from outside when no one was there? She rushed to lock all her doors and windows, but the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more persistent. Then, through her window, she saw the figure of the man from next door standing on her lawn, staring directly at her house. His eyes were cold, dark, and empty. She called the police, but when they arrived, they found no one. The house next door? Completely vacant. No furniture, no signs of life, just dust-covered floors and peeling walls. But the footsteps still come every night, and sometimes she can still feel someone watching her through the windows.